The grandfather's last game. Memory is a thief that steals in reverse. Instead of taking what we have, it steals what we will have tomorrow, leaving behind only the echoes of what we used to be. But sometimes, in the bright lights of an unexpected stage, memory gives us one last gift, a moment of perfect clarity before the darkness comes. The Family Feud studio hummed with its familiar pre-show energy, bathed in the warm glow of blue and gold lights that had illuminated countless moments of joy, surprise, and human connection. Steve Harvey stood at center stage, adjusting his royal blue tie, his movements carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had made this ritual his own, through years of bringing families together under these iconic lights. It was Friday afternoon in Los Angeles, and there was something special about the energy today. Not the manufactured excitement that television producers try to create, but something deeper, the kind of anticipation that comes when real love fills a space and transforms it into something sacred. On the left side of the stage stood the Martinez family from Phoenix, Arizona, 3 generations of educators and small business owners who had saved for 2 years to make this trip together, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that comes from fulfilling a shared dream. On the right side stood the Thompson family from rural Georgia, and at their center was a man whose presence seemed to anchor the entire group in something both profound and fragile. Joseph Grandpa Joe Thompson, 78 years old, stood second from the left at his family's podium, wearing a navy cardigan sweater that had been carefully pressed for this occasion. His silver hair was combed with the same meticulous care he'd brought to everything in his life, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the studio lights as he smiled at the cameras with the genuine warmth of someone who had spent 8 decades learning to appreciate every moment. To anyone watching, Joe looked like the picture of a beloved grandfather, dignified, proud, surrounded by a family that clearly adored him. His grandson Marcus, 22, stood protectively beside him, while his daughter Linda, 55, kept glancing at him with the mixture of love and concern that adult children reserve for aging parents they treasure. What the audience couldn't see was the secret that had brought the Thompson family to this studio with a desperate urgency that transformed a game show appearance into something resembling a final pilgrimage. 6 months earlier, Dr. Patricia Williams at Emory University Hospital had delivered news that had shattered the Thompson family's world, with the clinical precision that doctors learn when they have to give people information that will change everything. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease, she had said, sliding a folder across her desk that contained brain scans, test results, and treatment options that felt like reading about someone else's life. "We've caught it relatively early, which gives us time to prepare and plan." Joe had absorbed the diagnosis with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to every challenge in his 78 years. A World War II veteran who had survived the Battle of the Bulge, a teacher who had spent 40 years shaping young minds in rural Georgia classrooms, a father who had raised 4 children after his wife's death from cancer. 20 years earlier, he'd faced everything life had thrown at him, with courage, grace, and an unshakable faith that love could overcome any obstacle. But this was different. This was an enemy he couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't overcome through determination or force of will. This was his own mind slowly betraying him, stealing pieces of himself day by day, until eventually there would be nothing left of the man who had been the center of his family's world for nearly 8 decades. The early symptoms had been subtle enough that Joe had been able to hide them from his family for months, forgetting where he'd put his car keys, struggling to remember the names of neighbors he'd known for 30 years, losing his train of thought in the middle of conversations. He'd covered for himself with the skill of someone who understood that his family's emotional well-being depended on his strength. When he couldn't remember how to work the television remote, he'd claim he didn't want to watch anything anyway. When he forgot his grandson's girlfriend's name, he'd simply call her sweetheart and hope no one noticed. But the disease was progressing faster than Dr. Williams had initially predicted. The man who had once been able to recite entire poems from memory was now struggling to remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. The grandfather, who had been the family's repository of stories and wisdom, was finding it increasingly difficult to access the memories that had defined his identity for 8 decades. The diagnosis had come with a timeline that felt like a death sentence delivered in medical terminology. Mild cognitive impairment would progress to moderate dementia within 12 to 18 months. After that, severe dementia, loss of language, loss of recognition, loss of everything that made Joe who he was. Dr. Williams had been gentle, but clear in her prognosis. "We have a window," she'd said. "Maybe 6 months, maybe a year, where Mr. Thompson will still be himself most of the time. I encourage families to use this time to create final memories, to say the things that need to be said while he can still understand and respond." That night, Joe had sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he stared at the Family Feud application that had been sitting on his counter for 3 months. He'd been a fan of the show for 20 years, never missing an episode if he could help it. Every weeknight at 7 o'clock, Joe would settle into his recliner with his dinner and spend an hour calling out answers to Steve Harvey's questions, laughing at the unexpected responses, and feeling connected to the families who shared their joy and disappointment on his television screen. It had become more than just entertainment for Joe. It had become a ritual that connected him to something larger than his increasingly quiet life in rural Georgia. When his arthritis made it difficult to work in his garden, when his failing eyesight made reading challenging, when the loneliness of widowhood felt overwhelming, Family Feud remained a constant source of joy and connection. Marcus had been trying to convince him to apply for the show for years. "Grandpa, you know all the answers before they even ask the questions," he'd say. "We should get the whole family together and try out. It would be so much fun." Joe had always demurred, claiming he was too old, too set in his ways, too nervous about being on television. But the truth was that applying for Family Feud would have meant acknowledging that he wanted something for himself, and Joe had spent so many years putting his family's needs first that wanting something purely for his own joy felt almost selfish. Now, staring at that application with his diagnosis fresh in his mind, Joe realized that his window for experiencing joy was rapidly closing. If he was going to lose himself piece by piece over the coming months, if he was going to forget the people he loved and the memories that had sustained him, then he wanted one perfect memory to carry him through the darkness. He wanted to stand on that bright stage with his family, to feel the warmth of those lights, to hear Steve Harvey call his name, to experience one moment of pure happiness before his mind began its inexorable journey away from everything he treasured. Joe had filled out the application that night, writing in his careful script about his 40-year teaching career, his military service, and his deep love for a game show that had brought him comfort during the loneliest years of his life. He'd written about his family, his devoted daughter Linda, who called him every day, his grandson Marcus, who visited every weekend, his great-granddaughter Emma, who still believed her great-grandpa could fix anything. What he hadn't written was that this would likely be his last coherent memory with the people he loved most in the world. The call from the show's producers had come 3 weeks later, and Joe had cried with relief when they told him the Thompson family had been selected. Not sad tears, but tears of gratitude that he would have this chance. This one perfect day before his mind began to betray him completely. He'd told his family about the acceptance, but not about his diagnosis. He wanted them to experience pure joy without the shadow of what was coming. He wanted their memories of this day to be untainted by grief or fear or the desperate sadness of knowing they were saying goodbye to the man he used to be. Now, standing on that bright stage with cameras rolling and an audience cheering, Joe felt more present and alert than he had in months. The excitement, the adrenaline, the sheer joy of being exactly where he'd dreamed of being had cleared away the fog that had been clouding his thoughts for weeks. Steve Harvey had been particularly charming during the family introductions, spending extra time talking to Joe about his teaching career and his military service. Steve had a natural affinity for older contestants, recognizing the wisdom and perspective that came with decades of living. "Mr. Thompson," Steve had said, 40 years of teaching, and World War II veteran. Sir, you've seen this country change in ways most of us can only imagine. What's the secret to living a good life? Joe had smiled, his mind crystal clear in that moment. Love your family, serve your community, and never miss an opportunity to laugh, he'd said. Everything else is just details. The audience had applauded, and Steve had nodded approvingly. That's wisdom right there, folks. That's what 80 years of living looks like when you do it right. The game had progressed smoothly through the first 3 rounds. The Thompson family was holding their own against the Martinez family, with Joe contributing answers that showed his decades of experience watching the show and understanding how survey questions were typically answered. He'd gotten the biggest cheer of the night when he'd correctly guessed that meatloaf was the #1 answer to name something your grandmother made better than anyone else. His face had lit up with boyish delight when the board revealed he was right, and for a moment he looked like a child on Christmas morning rather than a man facing the loss of his memories. But as they entered the 4th round, Joe felt a familiar fog beginning to creep into his thoughts. The excitement and adrenaline that had kept him sharp were starting to fade, and he could sense his mind beginning to drift in the way that had become increasingly common over the past few months. He gripped the podium slightly tighter, trying to anchor himself in the present moment, trying to hold on to this perfect day for as long as possible. Steve announced the category with his usual enthusiasm. All right, Thompson family, this one's for you. Top 6 answers on the board. The studio lights seemed to intensify, and Joe blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. Sometimes the early symptoms of his condition made it difficult to process visual information, especially in bright or stimulating environments. We asked 100 people, Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio. What's something a grandfather never wants to forget? The question hit Joe like a physical blow. Of all the possible categories, of all the questions Steve could have asked, this one felt like it had been crafted specifically for his situation, specifically for this moment when he was desperately trying to hold on to memories that were already beginning to slip away. Marcus stepped up to the buzzer first, his young face confident and eager. His grandchildren's names, he announced with the certainty of someone who had never doubted that he would always be remembered. His grandchildren's names, Steve repeated warmly. Good answer, survey says. The board lit up. #2 answer, worth 26 points. The Thompson family cheered, and Joe forced himself to smile and clap, even as the irony of the answer cut through him like a blade. He'd forgotten his neighbor's name just that morning, had struggled to remember what his daughter did for work, had called Marcus Michael twice during the drive to the studio. Linda stepped up next. His wedding day, she called out, and Joe felt another stab of pain. He'd been forgetting details about his late wife Margaret for months now. The sound of her laugh, the way she hummed while cooking, the exact shade of blue of her eyes. His wedding day, Steve said. Survey says, #4 on the board, 18 points. Another celebration from the Thompson family. Another forced smile from Joe as he contemplated all the memories of Margaret that were already fading, becoming softer and less distinct every day. The game continued with answers like his children's birthdays and family traditions and important life lessons, each response a reminder of the vast repository of memories that Joe was slowly losing, piece by precious piece. When his turn came, Joe approached the buzzer with the careful steps of someone who was no longer entirely sure of his footing. The studio lights felt hot on his face, and he could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could feel the fog in his mind thickening slightly despite his efforts to stay present. Joe, Steve said, and something in the host's voice was different now. Gentler, more attentive. Grandpa Joe, what's something a grandfather never wants to forget? Joe looked at Steve Harvey, then at his family, then at the audience full of strangers who were all waiting for his answer. For a moment his mind went completely blank. Not the ordinary blankness of searching for the right words, but the terrifying emptiness that had been happening more frequently, the sensation of reaching for thoughts that were no longer there. Panic began to rise in his chest. What if he couldn't think of an answer? What if he just stood there, silent and confused, while hundreds of people watched him struggle? What if this perfect day ended with humiliation and the exposure of how much he'd already lost? Then, like sunlight breaking through clouds, clarity returned. Not because his condition had improved, but because the answer to Steve's question was so fundamental, so central to who he was, that even his failing mind couldn't let it slip away. "Their voices," Joe said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. "The sound of their voices saying, 'I love you, Grandpa.'" The studio fell silent. It wasn't the usual expectant quiet that followed an answer while everyone waited for the road to respond. This was something deeper, the kind of silence that comes when people recognize they've heard something profound, something that speaks to truths too important for casual entertainment. Steve's expression shifted completely. The game show host persona fell away, replaced by something more personal, more vulnerable. He'd heard thousands of answers over his years of hosting, but something in Joe's voice, something in the simple poetry of his response, had touched something fundamental. "The sound of their voices," Steve repeated slowly, and his own voice was thick with emotion. "Sevi says," the answer wasn't on the board, but no one cared about points anymore. Something had shifted in the studio, something that transcended games and competitions and television entertainment. Steve walked closer to Joe, abandoning his position behind the podium, to stand directly in front of the elderly man, who had just articulated something that every grandparent in the audience felt in their bones. "Joe," Steve said softly, "that's not just a good answer. That's the answer. That's what being a grandparent is all about." Joe looked up at Steve, and for a moment, his confusion was visible. Not about where he was or what he was doing, but about why this moment felt so important, why these words mattered so much, why he felt like he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away even as he spoke. "I'm starting to forget things," Joe said. And the admission came out quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself rather than to Steve or the audience or his family. "Important things. Things I never thought I could forget." The confession hung in the air like a prayer spoken in a sacred space. Behind Joe, his family exchanged glances of concern and sudden understanding. Linda's hand went to her mouth as she began to process what her father was telling them, and Marcus stepped closer to his grandfather with the protective instincts of someone who sensed that the man who had been his hero was in need of protection. Steve felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a gentle blanket. He'd been hosting television shows long enough to recognize when entertainment had transformed into something more important, when the artificial construct of a game show had become a space for real human connection and truth-telling. "What kind of things?" Steve asked gently, his voice carrying the kind of careful concern that invited honesty without demanding it. Joe looked around the studio, at the bright lights and the cameras, and the audience of strangers who had suddenly become witnesses to his most private fears. He thought about the diagnosis he'd been hiding, about the timeline Doc Williams had given him, about the certainty that his mind would continue to deteriorate until there was nothing left of the man his family loved. "I forget my neighbor's name sometimes," he said, his voice growing stronger as the truth began to flow. "I forget what my daughter does for work. Sometimes I call my grandson by his father's name. Yesterday, I couldn't remember how to work the coffee maker I've been using for 15 years. The studio was completely silent now, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something profound and private unfolding in the most public possible space. "But the worst part," Joe continued, tears beginning to form in his eyes, "is that I'm starting to forget my wife. Margaret, she died 20 years ago, and I've carried her memory with me every single day since then. But now I can't remember exactly what her voice sounded like when she laughed. I can't remember the songs she used to hum. I'm losing her all over again, and I don't know how to stop it." Steve Harvey, who had built his career on having the right words for every situation, found himself momentarily speechless. Behind Joe, Linda was openly crying, and Marcus had moved to stand directly beside his grandfather, one protective hand on the elderly man's shoulder. "Joe," Steve said finally, his voice gentle but clear. "What you're describing, have you talked to a doctor about this?" Joe nodded slowly. "6 months ago. Early Alzheimer's disease. They say I have maybe a year before." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the words that would make his future real. The admission settled over the studio, like a weight that everyone could feel. Alzheimer's disease wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was a thief that stole people gradually, piece by piece, until families were left mourning someone who was still alive but no longer entirely present. Steve turned to address Joe's family, who were clearly processing this information for the first time. "Did you all know about this?" he asked gently. Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We knew something was different, but Dad he never told us it was." She couldn't finish the sentence either. Marcus stepped forward, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell us? We could have helped, we could have been there for you." Joe turned to look at his grandson, and for a moment his eyes were perfectly clear, perfectly present. "Because I wanted you to remember me as I was," he said simply. "I wanted this day to be about joy, not sadness. I wanted one perfect memory before I start losing all the others." Steve felt something break open in his chest. He'd hosted thousands of episodes of Family Feud, had met countless families and heard hundreds of stories. But this was different. This was a man facing the loss of everything that made him who he was, and choosing to spend his last clear moments creating joy for the people he loved. "Joe," Steve said, walking closer to the elderly man. "Why Family Feud? Of all the things you could have chosen to do, why this?" Joe's face lit up with a smile that transformed him, making him look decades younger. "I've watched this show for 20 years, he said, his voice gaining strength as he talked about something that brought him pure happiness. "Every night at 7 o'clock, Margaret and I would watch together when she was alive, and I've watched by myself since then. It's been like having a family visit every evening, like being part of something bigger than my own life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I got the diagnosis, I realized that there were going to be a lot of last times in my life. Last time I remember my grandchildren's names. Last time I recognize my daughter's face. Last time I know who I am. But this," he gestured around the studio, "this gets to be a first time and a last time at once. My first time on Family Feud, and probably my last time feeling completely like myself." Steve Harvey stood in the middle of the Family Feud studio, surrounded by cameras and lights and hundreds of people, and felt humbled by the profound grace of the man standing in front of him. Joe Thompson wasn't asking for sympathy or pity. He was sharing his truth with dignity and courage, using his last clear moments to create joy rather than dwell on loss. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve said, turning to address the audience and the cameras, "what we're witnessing here today isn't just television. This is a masterclass in how to face the hardest challenges life can throw at us, with courage, dignity, and love. Joe Thompson has just told us that he's losing his memory to Alzheimer's disease. He could have spent today feeling sorry for himself, or angry at the unfairness of it, or scared about what's coming. Instead, he chose to come here with his family and create one perfect memory to carry with him." Steve walked back to Joe, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "That's not just courage, Joe. That's wisdom. That's showing all of us what it means to choose love over fear, joy over sorrow, connection over isolation." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing it into Joe's hand. "This has my direct number on it. Not for you to call me when you need help, for your family to call me when they need to remember how extraordinary you are." Joe looked at the card, then at Steve, his eyes bright with gratitude and something that looked like peace. "Thank you," he said simply. "This has been the best day I've had in a long time." Steve smiled, but he wasn't finished. "The game doesn't matter anymore," he announced to the studio. The points don't matter. What matters is that we've all learned something important today about what it means to live with grace in the face of impossible circumstances. He turned to address the cameras directly. Joe Thompson is going to lose his memories. That's the cruel reality of Alzheimer's disease. But today, he's created a memory that will live in the hearts of his family and everyone who witnessed this moment for the rest of their lives. Steve paused, his voice becoming more personal. And Joe, I want you to know something. You're worried about forgetting the sound of your grandchildren's voices saying I love you. But love isn't just something we remember. It's something we carry in our bones, in our hearts, in places that disease can't touch. He gestured to Marcus and Linda, who had moved to stand on either side of their grandfather. Even when your mind can't access the memories, your heart will still know that you are loved. Even when you can't remember their names, your soul will still recognize their presence. Love doesn't live in memory, Joe. It lives in something deeper, something permanent, something that Alzheimer's can never steal. The studio erupted in applause. But it wasn't the usual game show celebration. This was something deeper. The sound of people recognizing profound truth, of strangers being moved by the courage of one man facing his greatest fear with dignity and grace. Joe was openly crying now, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. For months, he'd been carrying his diagnosis in isolation, protecting his family from the knowledge of what was coming. Now, surrounded by their love and support, he felt lighter than he had since the day he'd first heard those 3 terrible words: Alzheimer's disease. Can I tell you something? Joe said to Steve, his voice steady despite his tears. I was so scared that when I started forgetting things, it would mean I loved my family less. But being here today, feeling all this love, I realized that's not how it works. He turned to look at Marcus and Linda, his face radiant with understanding. Love isn't something I remember, he said. It's something I am. Even when I can't remember your names or recognize your faces, I'll still be made of the love you've given me all these years. That's not going anywhere. Marcus wrapped his grandfather in a hug that spoke of 22 years of adoration and protection, and the fierce determination to make every remaining moment count. Linda joined them, and for a moment the 3 generations of Thompsons stood together on the bright stage, holding each other as if they could sup time through sheer force of love. Steve watched this family moment unfold, understanding that he'd witnessed something that transcended entertainment, something that would stay with him long after the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed. When the family finally separated, Joe looked around the studio one more time, taking in every detail, storing this perfect moment in whatever corner of his mind would be the last to surrender to the disease. I want to remember this, he said to Steve. I want to remember that I was here, that I got to do this, that my family was with me when I felt most like myself. Steve nodded, understanding the profound importance of this moment for Joe and his family. You will remember this, Joe. Maybe not in the way you remember things now, but in the way that matters most. This day will become part of who you are, part of the love that your family carries forward, part of the legacy that lives on regardless of what happens to your memory. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional impact or make it more palatable for television audiences. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the show's social media had been flooded with messages from viewers sharing their own stories of watching loved ones struggle with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But perhaps more importantly, Joe's appearance sparked a national conversation about the importance of creating meaningful memories with aging family members, about the courage it takes to face cognitive decline with grace, and about the ways that love transcends memory. 3 months later, Steve received a letter from Linda Thompson. Her father's condition had progressed more rapidly than doctors had predicted, and he was now living in a memory care facility near her home. Most days he didn't recognize her when she visited, but sometimes, she wrote, when she played the recording of his Family Feud appearance, something in his face would change. He wouldn't remember being on television or meeting Steve Harvey, but he would smile and say, "That sounds like a happy place." The letter continued, "Dad was right about love living somewhere deeper than memory. Even when he doesn't know who I am, I can see in his eyes that he knows he's with someone who loves him. The fear is gone, the anxiety is gone. What's left is just pure, uncomplicated love." She ended with, "Thank you for giving us that perfect day." It wasn't just his last clear memory. It became the foundation for how we understand love in the face of loss. Joe Thompson had worried about forgetting the sound of his grandchildren's voices saying, "I love you, Grandpa." But in the end, he discovered something more profound, that love doesn't require memory to exist, doesn't need recognition to be real, doesn't depend on cognitive function to transform lives. A grandfather never wants to forget that love is bigger than memory, stronger than disease, and more permanent than any individual mind that tries to contain it. The story is designed to entertain, inspire, and encourage discussions about aging, memory care, and family support. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.